We're kicking off today's podcast, and we have former Sergeant Jim Moriarty from the US Marine Corps, who served in Vietnam, and Sam is with us, who's one of our voice actors, who voices the vets in our game. And welcome, Jim.
Thank you.
We're glad to have you, and you're over from Texas.
Well, Texas and California. I'm actually in California today.
Right. Okay. So probably a bit warmer than us. Well, thanks for joining us today to talk about your experiences. Can we just sort of break the ice with asking what you've been up to lately?
Well, a couple of things, as you know, because you guys have been heavily involved in it. We've been working for years to see if we could get Paris Davis awarded the Medal of Honor. And we're sort of constantly working that problem and continue to see if we can push that through the bureaucracy. And then the other thing is, and I don't know if you and I have talked about this, but I represent about 180 of service members or their families who were injured at the al-Assad Iran missile attack from 2 years ago. In fact, I'll actually be flying to DC tomorrow, meeting up with one of my partners, and we'll drive down to Fort Bragg, where about 25 of these kids will be awarded the Purple Heart at a ceremony on Thursday afternoon. So that's basically what I've got going on right now.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thanks, Jim. And I know people who know some of those kids who are getting the Purple Heart. So from him, thank you, from that one guy. And I'm sure there's many families out there, because it means a lot, doesn't it? It's not just the medal you wear on your uniform. It's what you get that comes with it.
It's actually a whole lot more than that. Our service members, our sons and daughters who serve our country in uniform, are, but in large part, doing it because they love their country. They want to prove themselves. They want to get an education. They're doing it for their friends, but they want to be appreciated. They want to be recognized for the sacrifices they made. And what happened on that Iran missile attack case is our highest level leaders, both political and military, made the decision that it was untoward to acknowledge that all of those kids had suffered traumatic brain injuries. So the word came down from on high, no more Purple Hearts. And so in excess of 50 of those young men and women who clearly qualified for Purple Hearts were denied Purple Hearts. And it was really fascinating for me, because the kids that got medevac automatically got their Purple Hearts. The kids that chose to stay and fight did not. And even some of these kids actively lied about their injuries, claiming they weren't injured so that they could stay with their buddies, they could stay in the fight. And all three groups were pissed off because the people who got medevaced, and it was a relatively small amount, knew that their buddies had been stiff. The people who stayed and fought and denied being injured recognized that the people who were injured weren't recognized. And so it was extremely satisfying to me and my team that we were able to bring significant attention in the court of public opinion. We had a couple of CBS News stories. We had a Rachel Maddow did about 20 minutes of coverage over a couple of days. We got, I forget whether it was Washington Post or New York Times story. And the fortunate thing was that the spokesman for the Department of Defense had acknowledged in an interview that there was political pressure to not award these Purple Hearts. So we brought that information to the attention of the the military, and those Purple Hearts were awarded post haste.
That's fantastic. Oh, well done, Jim. To you and your team. Do we have any news at this current time on the Paris Davis and his Medal of Honor?
Well, I literally got an email today. Basically, anybody who has the power to affect that Medal of Honor, or anybody who knows anybody who has power to affect that Medal of Honor, we've been leaning on 4 months. And we've made contact with the appropriate people in the Department of the Army. We're putting pressure on them. We're reminding them, this was 55 years ago. And the delay and the bureaucracy and the bullshit continues to be nerve-wracking. And to me, it's particularly important to have that medal awarded during his lifetime. I'm in the process of reading a 1,100-page biography of President Truman. And it's really fascinating to me to see the rank hypocrisy and prejudice, racial prejudice that goes back 150 years. And the very idea that our military would lose Paris Davis's award package, not once, but twice, and that we would still be chasing down witnesses 55 years after the fact, just literally offends me to the core. When you're in combat, and you guys know this because you've talked to so many of our most valiant warriors, when you're in combat, you're not spending a lot of time paying attention to the race, the gender, the sexual orientation, or anything else about the warrior who's in the foxhole next to you. You're paying attention to, are they shooting back at the enemy like you are? And I've had this unique honor of getting to know these Special Forces guys and being involved. I was involved in Mike Rose Medal of Honor. And in my view, we just can't do enough to recognize how courageous those people are. So I get emails on that, if not daily, certainly weekly, and we've got a bunch of people working the issue.
Yeah, well, obviously, Rose got his Medal of Honor in 2016 or 17? 17, yeah. So that's one early victory on the SOG medals, and hopefully with Paris Davis we'll get some good news. So let's keep the message going out. We'll do our bit where we can, and that we all know you're doing your bit, and thank you for doing it.
Well, and let me say this, because your viewers need to know this. The thing that to me is such an extraordinary honor of having the ability to be involved in these efforts is people you meet. When I found out that you guys would do images for us, that you guys would do graphics that we could use as part of the package, I was stunned. I was absolutely blown away. And the first question I had was, who's paying for it? Because I was hoping I wouldn't pay for it. And the second question I had was, really? And it's the idea that people come together from all over the world, from all different backgrounds, to support these efforts today is extraordinary. And you guys just deserve enormous credit. I can still see those images in my mind. And even though we only had about a month or 5 weeks to put that online package together, in my view, the images that you guys provided as a courtesy bring that whole package to life, and will be a significant reason why that package will ultimately be awarded, in my view.
I really hope so. Just for the viewers' benefit, the guys in our team who worked on the images were former French Army, serving Singapore Army, and serving Portuguese Army, all getting behind, a 55-year-old medal campaign for Paris Davis. So it definitely, we branch out around the world in supporting Paris for being recognised for his heroic deeds. And when people read the story, and we'll link it in the description here on YouTube, you can't fail to realise that this guy needs a Medal of Honor. It's crystal clear in the story, in the package we put together. Can I ask you, Jim, why you think it's important for people to know about the Vietnam War, 55 years later?
Well, narratives go awry for 1,001 different reasons. The people that I knew and that I fought with in Vietnam were some of the most courageous, most honest, and bravest people I've ever known. And the narrative even today for the Vietnam vet is loser, drug addict, white trash. And there was this profound disrespect for our Vietnam service members that has only shifted over time. And in part, they shift because of people like you and people who tell the true story, tell the story that people can come to understand. I know doctors, lawyers, dentists, mechanics, all sorts of people that I served with 55 years ago. And even I was a high school dropout. My twin brother conned me into going into the Marine Corps. So I dropped out of high school in January 65, go in the Marine Corps. And I ended up going to Vietnam for the first time in the summer of 66 after I graduated from school. We knew in the summer of 66 that we were going to lose the war. Now, I was, a 19-year-old, 20-year-old kid, so I knew nothing of the geopolitical issues. But I knew we were getting our ass kicked in that war, and I knew leadership sucked, and military leadership sucked, and political leadership sucked. And we knew we were going to lose. And I stayed for 2 more tours of duty, and then my older brother served from 64 to 65. From 65, 66 in Vietnam. I served from 66 to 68, and my twin brother served from 68 to 70. So we covered the whole significant time of the Vietnam War. And then, of course, since then, because of the work that I've done with the Special Forces, the SAW guys, I've dealt with a lot of people who fought in 69, 70, 71. And to a person, people knew we were going to get our ass kicked. And they still went out and they fought courageously. They protected their buddies. They fought the mission they were assigned. We went out in shitty conditions, shitty weather with crappy equipment to protect our buddies. And that raw courage I've never forgotten that. And while I think it's extremely admirable, the respect that our military has gotten since the first Middle Eastern War in 1990, in my view, the Vietnam vets were due all of that respect and more. So to me, it's extremely important that the story of who those people were and who they became during their lifetimes needs to be told, and everybody who tells that story to me is important.
Thank you. And can I just touch on Operation Tailwind, as that kind of links into what we were just talking about? So could you just outline what happened around Operation Tailwind in the media in the 90s, and then what you did about it?
Yeah, and Operation Tailwind was a well-known cross-border, deeper into Laos attack than any other attack that had taken place during the Vietnam War. Basically, 150 Montyards and American Special Forces went farther in Laos than they had ever been allowed to go before. And that strategic mistake turned out to be remarkably important because the North Vietnamese never had any idea that we would actually go that far in. 3-day battle, a few of the Montyards were killed. Almost everybody was wounded on the mission. And the Americans came out in, I think, on September 12th or 13th, 1970. It was one of the most important and the most significant battles of the Vietnam War because they brought out footlockers full of secret documents that showed where the base camps were, where the supply camps were, where the Ho Chi Minh was. And people in our intelligence believed that battle stopped the North Vietnamese from successfully invading South Vietnam for a couple of years. All of those people that fought in that mission were sworn to secrecy with 25-year non-disclosure agreements. So in 1995, that those 25-year non-disclosure agreements were up, and a couple of former Special Forces guys started writing books. John Plaster and some others. The news media found out about that, and there was a team of news people from AOL Time Warner, a gal named April Oliver, who went down to Fort Bragg to do a story. And while she was at Fort Bragg, she met with a former CBS cameraman named Mike Marriott, and Mike Marriott told her about these sort of screwy missions that he had been involved in Vietnam. And April Oliver formed the idea that our government lied about the gas that was used on Operation Tailwind, and that the actual purpose of the mission was to go into Laos to kill American defectors. And they used sarin nerve gas for the first time in American history to kill these defectors. Well, the story was 100% complete bullshit. The Operation Tailwind people pulled off one of the great coups of the Vietnam War because they got so far in that they were never going to be able to hike their way out. But for the bravery of the Air Force combat crews, the Marine Corps CH-53 crews, the Marine Corps Cobra gunship crews, and other allied air forces, we would have lost all of those people, and it would have been a grave disaster. But we got out, we got the equipment out, we got the secret documents out, and that was a huge windfall. So April Oliver did a first story on Special Forces, trashing the Special Forces people, and I think maybe 96 or 97. And her executives at AOL Time Warner said, well, we think there's a bigger story there. Let's do the bigger story. And so she puts together this story that our people were using sarin nerve gas and went in Laos to kill American defectors. Well, there's never been any evidence, never, that our troops were ever assigned to kill American defectors. And the truth is, I don't think you could get them to kill them. I mean, for Christ's sake, we knew we were going to lose war. It wasn't like somebody was going to take over the White House. because they had decided to go over the enemy. There were a small number of people who went over the enemy, but they weren't significant in any way. But the bigger issue was the claim of sarin nerve gas. And if you remember in 1998, we were having discussions with the Iraqis, and Saddam Hussein and his foreign minister were saying, we don't have nerve gas, we don't have chemical weapons. And oh, by the way, since AOL Time Warner said you guys are using sarin nerve gas, we're not going to let you in. We're not going to let the inspectors come into our country to search for our chemical weapons. And you can make the link between Operation Tailwind, the story, CNN, AOL Time Warner story, Valley of Death, and Saddam Hussein refusing to allow the weapons inspectors in. And I was hired in about 2000, at the latest 2001, by the last three Special Forces guys to represent them and sue AOL Time Warner, which I did. We took Peter Arnett's deposition. We took Floyd Abrams' deposition. We took April Oliver's deposition. And to my knowledge, I'm the only person, or my partner is the only people in the world that have those video depositions. And it was really fascinating to me because it was, even a baby knows the difference between the truth and lie. If you take a baby and you pinch the baby and then you smile and you say, I love you, the baby knows something's wrong. We all know the difference between somebody telling us the truth, somebody lying. The witnesses whose depositions I took in the Operation Tailwind case were such flagrant liars who were making up stories that were beyond silly. Now, and understand this, I'm as liberal as anybody you're ever going to meet in your lifetime. I really believe that a free press is extraordinarily important. But when I looked at the witnesses that CNN used to propagandize this story, I'm sitting there thinking, these have to be the dumbest bastards I've ever seen, because you can't sit in a room with these people without knowing they're lying. They had a so-called preacher from North Carolina who was buddies with a guy named Van Buskirk, Robert Van Buskirk. Van Buskirk had been the number 2 guy on the mission. And Van Buskirk was just a world-class snake. He had lived a life of corruption and dishonesty his whole life. And so Buskirk supposedly knew this preacher. And this preacher comes out of the woodwork and he tells April Oliver, well, yeah, I was there. I know what happened. We were a mile and a half away and we're in a little hidey hole and we're watching through our binoculars and I can see a blonde-haired guy a mile and a half away with my binoculars. And I knew that was an American. And then they came in and it was gas and, they all died. And I mean, I'm sitting there thinking, I've been a deer hunter for decades. And I've had binoculars and I've had spotting scopes where I could actually see a deer from a mile and a half away. And I'm lucky if I can tell the difference between a doe and a buck at a mile and a half. And come to find out, this guy was an Air Force. He was an overweight, 37-year-old Air Force sergeant from one of the air bases in Saigon. And his job was parking the airplanes at Tom Snoot Air Force Base. And he tells this elaborate story about how he had gone to Hawaii and the President of the United States tracked him down and said, I got this mission I need you to go on. And, I'm not going to tell you where it is or when it is or how it is, but you're going to be contacted by people and they're doing it for me. And I'm sitting there going, that's the kind of story that if you told that, you'd want to pour some whiskey on your shirt so that people thought you were drunk instead of thinking you were stupid, because it's just bullshit. And the whole premise premise to the story was complete bullshit. And that's how I got to know these Special Forces guys. That's how I got connected up with them and got to recognize how extraordinary they were. And that's how I came to realize that, yeah, the press can really mess it up. And they did. And it was, to me, it was shameless. And I'm forgiving them for it yet.
And the resulting lawsuit, you won, and there was an apology?
No. There had been a motion to dismiss filed in the case early on. The judge denied the motion to dismiss. I spent a king's ransom getting the case ready for trial because I thought this judge will actually allow us to get to trial in this case. You know, that was during the time period when General Westmoreland had his lawsuit against the news media. And so I thought, you know, I'm going to have the opportunity to right this wrong. And then just before trial, they renewed their motion to dismiss. And this time the judge granted the motion to dismiss and threw us out. I was able to successfully settle the 3 remaining claims for some amount of money, not, in my view, nearly enough. But we ended up being poured out by the court on a legal matter.
Right. I thought there was definitely an apology from the network.
There was. It was that. Well, I say there was an apology. You know, if you remember, that was when social media was expanding, the internet was expanding, people were using computers. And these service members who knew about that were just absolutely outraged when CNN came out with the story because everybody knew the story was bullshit. I mean, it was just like, we're going to go 50 miles in Laos. We're going to send 150 men 150 miles in Laos to kill a few American defectors, and we're going to use sarin nerve gas on them for the first time in American history. If you were going to use sarin nerve gas, there are probably some strategic values that would have a whole lot higher priority than to do that. But I lost my train of thought there, so let's go back to your question. I'll see if I can answer it this time.
Well, I guess I was going to sort of summarize really that at the end of all that, 16 years later, you know, Gary Michael Rose got his Medal of Honor thanks to you again, and he probably wouldn't have got that if there was still doubt about that mission. You know, if that story was still
floating. He did get the Medal
out.
of Honor, and he so richly deserved the Medal of Honor, and that came as a result of the outrage of all of these Special Forces people and all of these SOG people, all of the people you talk to all the time. I know all about what was going on, and they were outraged. And CNN did apologize. Now, it was a mealy mouth, whiny, hair splitting apology. You know, we've all screwed stuff up. And the best thing you can do when you screw something up is look at the person you've done wrong to, look them straight in the face and say, I know what I did. I apologize for what I did. I know I was wrong. How can I make it up to you? And it was CNN needed to maintain the pretense that was, well, it was we made some mistakes. They didn't make mistakes. They were complete dumbasses. They completely ignored the meaningful evidence, and they told a story which was deliberately harmful to our country. Those young men and women who ended up serving after during the Gulf War. And those kids that we lost in that first Gulf War, we lost because Saddam Hussein continued this pretense of, I'm not going to let you in. And part of the basis was that he said, you guys are hypocrites. Well, first off, we had sold him the nerve gas that he had. So we knew that 30 years ago, 40 years ago, we knew he had weapons of mass destruction because we provided it to him. But more importantly, that story gave him the excuse of keeping the weapons inspector out. And the next thing you know, we're going to war with them again. And you can make a good argument that every war we fought in the Middle East since 1998 was based on that foundation of sand.
So could I ask you why? Do you have a theory as to why, in the media, when they talk about the Vietnam War, they focus on My Lai and napalming villages and war crimes?
Well, when you create a narrative and that narrative becomes historical, it's hard to get away from the narrative. It's much harder to change a narrative than it is to create a false narrative in the first place. The United States lied our way into that war. We lied our way into that war with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution in August of '64. The Navy certainly had reason to know that they were not indeed under attack by the North Vietnamese. There had been unusual activity by the North Vietnamese because the CIA, operating with special folks from South Vietnam, were making raids on the North Vietnamese coast. And so it's the news media knew at some level that much of our government was lying about the war. And the news media formed their own conclusions about what that meant. And part of that was to attack the soldiers rather than to attack the war. So you had these narratives of they're all dopers, they're all fragging their officers. And those narratives have held up and been continued by the media ever since. I lost a huge amount of respect for the American media after the CNN debacle, because it was obvious that the only thing that mattered to them was money and ratings. And they didn't give a shit whether the story was false, and they didn't give a shit whether the story harmed our country, and they didn't give a shit whether it meant that our kids were going to go to war based on falsehoods. And so
it's really sad.
Yeah, there's still not a good movie or TV show. I mean, if you think of what Band of Brothers did for Easy Company, 501st in World War II, and almost hagiographic, it's kind of really putting these guys on a pedestal, although it does show through their characters, the warts and all, if the guys are drinking to cope, guys suffering with post-traumatic problems. And it shows a lot of that stuff. It's kind of quite modern in the way, it's looking at men in war. But we have nothing like that about Vietnam, really, that I can think of.
Here's what you want to remember. If you go look at the war movies from the 40s and the 50s and even to the 60s, they were bloodless, they were heroic, they were stand by your man, take care of your buddy. They were myths. And, John Wayne grew up, half of John Wayne's myth was a cowboy and the other half was Marine hero. There is a huge gulf in this country between what I would describe as the warmongers and the warriors. And the warmongers are people who sell airplanes and build boats and build guns and build ammo, build bombs. And war is really good for them. And we've got the young men and women of this country who believe that we have a country worth fighting for. And there's actually a huge gulf between those two entities, those two groups. It's, for example, the military housing cases I'm doing. None of the people who are involved in billions of dollars of military housing, none of the companies are run by warriors. The burn pit stories that are just coming out now, the work that John Stewart's doing on burn pits, we've known that burn pits are a disaster going back decades. We've known that our kids are dying from cancer that we have no explanation for why they've got such a high percentage of it. And so part of the reason you've got these false narratives about Vietnam and about all of our wars is there are factions within our country and our society where a lot of people like to play up the heroism and make them out to be really good people. What they don't do is they don't actually support those troops. They don't actually provide housing that's habitable or weapons that actually work. They know or they believe there's essentially an unlimited supply of young men and women who will go to fight for their country. And so they can keep making their profit and making their money. So that's part of the reason you have these dueling narratives is you got people who want to continue the conventional wisdom. It's probably 1,000 times more important to talk about what the CIA was doing in Vietnam than it is to talk about what some dumbass drafty Lieutenant Calley had. And it also shows you this fracture in our society. You know, Nixon let Calley out of jail, just like Trump let those war criminals out of jail. And if you go talk to the people who serve our country, most of them believe that people who commit war crimes ought to be held accountable. But we didn't do that in Vietnam, and we're not doing it now.
Wow.
It's a really interesting sort of deep dive into Vietnam and the media. This,
absolutely.
It's a subject really close to our hearts because obviously we're focusing on trying to tell stories that have not really been heard. There are some books, there are some podcasts, but to get really deep into those stories, you want to be immersed. And ideally, a TV show or a movie on SOG would be fantastic. You know, if we could get something like that going. That would be, it would make my decade.
Done right.
These stories need to be told. Can we getting into the stories? Can we kind of dial it back to your military career and start looking into that? So I'll hand you over to Sam on this one.
Yeah, Jim, you were talking about Operation Tailwind there. For our audience, I just finished listening to Tilt's Sogcast, episode 8 with Gary Mike Rose, and talking about his experience there was really incredible to hear from his perspective. So for anybody who wants to learn that story from his perspective, absolutely listen to that. It's on Spotify, on YouTube. That's Sogcast with Tilt. But Jim, can you explain so you talked about your brother. How did you end up joining the Marines, and how did you end up becoming a door gunner?
Good question. I was young and stupid, and I got an identical twin brother, and my identical twin brother and I were split up when we were about 5, and he grew up across the country from me, and I ended up growing up in Houston, and we had no contact from the time we were 5 until the time we were 13. Or the time we were 18. I didn't realize it at the time, but I had been held back like in the 1st or 2nd grade. So Bob graduated from high school and June of 64, and I was scheduled to graduate from high school in June of 65. Now, I would have never graduated because, like I say, I was young and stupid. But Bob goes out to California looking for me because he thinks that's where I live, runs out of money, and ends up enlisting in the Marine Corps in the late summer of 64. And he goes through boot camp in San Diego, and he runs into a guy that I had gone to high school with. So I get a call from my mother because I was living on my own from the time I was 16. I get a call from my mother at Christmas of 65 or Christmas 64. And she says, I got a surprise for you. I want you to come over. So I go over the house, and lo and behold, there's my identical twin brother who I haven't seen for 13 years. Well, he tells me about the dress blues and the girls and the parties and the beer. And I'm thinking, how can I turn this down? I mean, this sounds like a hell of a deal. And so I promptly dropped out of high school and joined the Marine Corps. It's 35 years later before I figure out that son of a bitch got 5 days free leave for every mullet he showed up with, and I was his first mullet. So I go off to boot camp. I start boot camp February 2nd, 1965. And Marine Corps boot camp at that time was 13 weeks. And they were the toughest son of bitches that I had ever seen in my life. And what happened is now I had some structure and some rules to follow in my life. And I very, very quickly figured out there's officers who get more money and have more respect and better jobs, and there's enlisted guys and they have the shittier jobs. And they don't get treated with the same respect. They don't get paid the same. And the only difference is education. So I formed the idea, I'm going to get me an education, because nobody in my family had ever gone to college. Nobody in my family had ever mentioned college. So I go through boot camp, and while I was in boot camp in probably April of 65, there was that Life magazine article that came out that had the picture of the Marine door gunner on a UH-34, where the story had been told for Life magazine of this mission. And it was told not from the perspective of the pilots, but from the perspective of the door gunner. And I had been, I was smart and had done really well on all my tests. And I was guaranteed that I'd be given the aviation schools. And so I decided I'm going to be a door gunner. So my twin brother goes off and he goes to flight school, and I go to Millington, Tennessee, where I spend the next year in schools. And I went to 6 different schools and graduated first in my class in 5 of them. And they gave me my choice of orders anywhere in the world because I had done so well on my test. So I fill out the form, and my first choice, Vietnam, my second choice, Vietnam, and my third choice, Vietnam. Guess where they sent me?
I'm guessing it wasn't Vietnam.
Iwakuni, Japan. I go off. I'm sitting there thinking I got to be the only subject in the world who cannot volunteer to get sent to Vietnam. I go to Okinawa, and they send me, I think it was Mag 12, that had, there were 2 squadrons. There was a Phantom Squadron and then an A4 Squadron at Iwakuni, Japan. So they promptly shipped me to VMA 211, the A4 Squadron. And so I spent July, August, September in Iwakuni, and then finally in October of 66, I finally get sent down to Vietnam. And I was an unhappy camper because I had joined the Marine Corps to be a hero, and not a dead hero, but hopefully a live hero, and get a chance to shoot an indigenous personnel, and they provide the ammo and stuff, which I thought was only fair. And so what I ended up doing is I'm working on radios on an A4, and the only way I was ever going to be able to kill an indigenous personnel was if I put the radios in wrong and the airplane crashed and landed in somebody's village. So the 196 Light Infantry moved into Chulai in December, January of 67. And what I would do is I'd go down on the 1 day off a week I had, and I'd fly with their aviation unit. They had a 47 squadron, and they had some Huey squadrons. And so I'd go fly with them. And then in June of 67, they had a program where I could extend for a second tour of duty for 6 months in Vietnam. I'd get a free ticket anywhere in the world, paid ticket to take 30 days leave and come back and serve 6 months. So I did that. And I asked to be assigned to helicopter squadron. And so they promptly sent me to VMO2 in Marble Mountain. So I served with VMO2 for a little over the next year.
Okay. And VMO2, what was the name of that unit? Because I know, wasn't VMO3, was that Scarface?
VMO3 was Scarface. VMO2 was Hostage. And VMO6 was, I think, Deadlock.
Okay. Yeah, I've heard of Hostage before. So you served with the Army first. Well, you served in the Marines supporting an Army unit, the 196th, and they were the aircraft that you were flying with. Were they part of a organic aviation unit as part of the 196th?
They were, but all I was doing was going down and flying with them on my day off. So they didn't have anything to do with Marines. And you know, I could always find somebody who didn't want to work that day, and I could go fly the missions.
I guess connections are everything. Yeah, hard to argue with that. What when you got to VMO2, what units were you supporting there?
They had been doing some SOG missions. What I did when I joined VMO2, keep in mind by this time I was 20 or 21 years old, and I still wanted to be a hero, but I wanted to be a live hero. Mm-hmm. So what I did was I hooked myself up with the biggest, meanest, toughest crew chief in the squadron, a guy named Charlie Maddox, who became my best friend for decades. And Charlie had flown. In fact, Charlie had actually been shot down on SOG missions before in Laos. And but they had discontinued. This would have been August, September, October 67. So VMO2 was not flying SOG missions. So we were mostly flying gun cover for various UH-34 medevac squadrons, or we were flying gun cover for 1st Recon that was over out of Da Nang. Occasionally, we would go up north and we'd fly missions out of Phu Bai, but by and large, we were flying in the Da Nang, Happy Valley area and the area west of Da Nang.
Okay, roger that. Yeah, that's awesome to get an overview of that. Do you want to jump into missions then, Rob?
Yeah, I'll cover that. Yeah, sure. So, first of all, can I ask? I'll jump ahead on a question and ask you, what with VMO2? What was the aircraft you were flying? Was it the E model Huey?
It was a UH-1E. Yeah. In fact, it's we actually a buddy of mine owns one of the UH-1Es. That was literally one of our squadron aircraft from 55 years ago.
Wow, that's amazing.
Go on. It's sort of a fun story. I had restored a UH-34 Sikorsky what happened was in the mid-90s, I started making a bunch of money. And so, I do the same thing anybody does when they make a bunch of money. I bought a T-28 and I bought a Maul and I bought a UH-34 Sikorsky and I bought an A-4 Skyhawk. And so, fortunately, after that, most of this money was not burning a hole in my pocket anymore. But I painted this 34 in Marine Corps colors in HMM 362 colors. It was Yankee Lima 42. And I'll tell you sort of a fun story about that. It was, to me, a typical Vietnam story. I knew that I wanted to, it was offensive to me that I'd go to air shows and they had World War II aircraft, and you'd have these old farts showing up and wearing blue jeans and tennis shoes, and they'd fly these World War II aircraft. And you had Marines and Air Force and Navy guys show up flying current aircraft, but you had no Vietnam aircraft. And I thought that's just bullshit. I mean, those were the people I served with, and I want to honor. So I bought this 84 Skyhawk and the T-28 and the 34. Charlie Maddox got me in buying 34. Charlie was working for me at this time, my preaching. So he walks into my office one day and says, "Boy, have I got a deal for you." And that should have told me everything I needed to know. I said, "Well, what do you got?" And he said, "Well, we can buy a UH-34 Sikorsky for $50,000. And I'm going, "Well, shit, how can I turn that down?" And so it turned out that this was sitting up in somebody's yard up in Connecticut or someplace like that. And of course, I knew nothing about restoring airplanes or helicopters, particularly helicopters, and wasn't licensed to fly helicopters at the time. So I said, "Well, go in there and tell them I'll give them 40 grand for it." So I buy this helicopter for 40 grand, which is probably 39,000 more than it was worth. And we have it shipped out to Tucson, Arizona. I find the guy that's sort of the UH-34 restoration expert in the country. And I pay this guy $250,000 to restore this airplane flight, redo overall the engine and transmissions and all that kind of stuff. So one of these former 362 pilots flies the airplane to Houston, and they don't have any radios, no navigational equipment, no GPS, nothing. Well, by this time, I was flying the T-28 in the Maul, and so I wanted to fly the 34, but I'm not going to fly without radios. So I go out to the radio shop that did the work on my T-28. And I said, "Well, I've got this reunion down." And now keep in mind that this 34 is now proudly painted in Marine Corps colors. And, it's looks like the real deal. And so I go to the radio shop and I said, "Look, I really need you to put these radios in this airplane, Navcom and transponder and ADF and GPS, and, I'll pay for all the equipment stuff." He says, "Well, when's this reunion?" And I said, "Well, it's in 6 weeks. And he goes, "If I put you on the schedule to do these radios, I'm going to have to put you on the schedule for 6 months." Now, his story is that I got down on my knees and I begged. Now, my story is very different. And I'm sitting there thinking, well, shit, what do I do now? And so he says, "Why did you paint this Marine Corps colors?" And I could hear something in his question. I didn't know what it was, but I could hear something in his question. And I said, "Well, I've dropped out of high school and go to Vietnam and did 3 tours of duty and was a door gunner and crew chief on a UH-1E and brave people, and I want to honor them." And he said, "Where'd you serve?" And again, I can hear something in the question. I said, "Well, the first year that I was there, I was in Chu Lai, And then the second year I was there, the second, third tour of duty, I was there. I was at Marble Mountain. And he says, well, I was at Chulai. And I'm going, And I said, really? What'd you do in Chulai? And he says, well, I was with the Seabees, and we put down the Marsden matting at Chulai. And I said, well, we were launching A4s. We were launching A4s with JTO bottles off the Marsden matting. Marsden matting was a concept of aviation, went back to World War II. And I said, well, we were flying off that stuff. And he says, my son's a servant in the Marine Corps. And again, I could hear something in his voice. I said, well, what does your son do? And he says, he's a flight instructor. And I said, what kind of aircraft? And he says, a Huey. And so I get up and I'm brushing my knees off because I know this conversation is over. And I said, look, if you can get this stuff done more than a week beforehand, I'll fly down there and we'll get it done. And, and sure enough, he got it done and we got the airplane down there. This was the first time that anybody had shown up at a Marine Corps reunion. We had have an organization called Vietnam Combat. It's now called the Marine Corps Combat Helicopter Association, but at that time it was called the Vietnam Helicopter Combat Association. First time anybody had ever shown up with a authentic aircraft painted in authentic colors. And there was a guy from Las Vegas who showed up. He had bought a UH-1E that was one of the aircraft that we actually had that served VMO6 and VMO2 that was actually worked on. The TAT 101 gun kit was put in by a friend of mine. And so he showed up in Pensacola with this Huey, and it was painted in civilian colors. And a Huey that's painted in civilian colors is like a model showing up wearing a flour sack. It just doesn't look right, And so I got to be buddies with the guy. And a couple of years later, he said, I'm thinking about selling this airplane. And I said, well, why don't you give it to the Collins Foundation? Because I'd gotten involved with the Collins Foundation by then. And he ends up giving the Huey to the Collins Foundation. And I ended up paying part of the restoration costs of that Huey. And so if you wanted to fly a legitimate Vietnam era VMO2, VMO6 Huey, the Collins Foundation owns it, and it came through as a result of what we did. And what I learned from that, and it was really fascinating. These aircraft and these missions affect our life forever. And I had gotten rated to fly helicopters by then, and I would fly the 34 air shows on the East Coast and the West Coast every year. And I could see people walking up to the aircraft, and I could tell you what their connection was to the aircraft by how they approached the aircraft. And I had to face the dilemma of what do I do about letting people in the aircraft, letting people fly the aircraft, letting people touch the aircraft. And what I came down to, now keep in mind, I had more money than sense. What it came down to was it was an opportunity for me to honor the people that I served with. And anybody that wanted to fly it, I was going to let fly it. Anybody that wanted to get in it or be flown around in it was going to get it. And my attitude was, if I can't figure out how to get the switches back in the right position, I shouldn't be flying the airplane. So I flew hundreds and hundreds of people in the aircraft, never charged anybody a dime, never let anybody buy any fuel for it, except, when I do these air shows, I have the air show provide fuel. and it was something I'll never forget.
That is
That's
so
fantastic.
cool.
Yeah, fantastic bit of history there, Jim, for your personal history, but also with the associations as well. And so when you were in Vietnam and you were flying, were you, with VMO2, for example, were you flying slicks or gunships or both?
Well, we had, we called the slicks green taxi service, and I liked flying stick missions. What had happened was I was pretty senior. I had been in Vietnam for a long time. So I became qualified to fly as a crew chief, even though I was an aviation electronics technician. And some pretty cool missions where we'd fly green taxi service. And that was, we'd have a pilot who'd fly from the right seat. We'd have a crew chief who'd fly from the left seat, no guns, just doors. And we would fly, for example, ROC officers, Republic of Korea officers, or we'd go over and we'd pick up Marine Corps generals. We'd take them flying around. And it was pretty cool because the pilots were, of course, they were only a couple of years older than we were, and they'd let us fly the aircraft or play like we were flying the aircraft. And that was an interesting experience. But the missions I enjoyed the most were gunship missions, because that's what, that's why I joined the Marine Corps.
And sort of, do you recall sort of how many combat missions you might have flown in gunships?
About 120. I ended up being awarded, I think, 6 air medals and 2 single mission air medals. And they were typically awarded for 20 strike flight missions, which really wasn't very many. I mean, my twin brother flew like 750 or 800 missions. I think Charlie had maybe 40 air medals. Charlie had like 800 missions, but Charlie had served 3 tours in Vietnam like I did. He served as a crew chief from day one. But it was enough where I got to experience what it was like and do some cool missions.
Yeah, that's a lot of action. And can you remember what your first experience of combat was?
I could not only remember it, I'd never forget it. It was October 9th or October 10th of 1967. And like I say, I latched myself like a limpet mine with Charlie, because I knew Charlie was the most experienced crew chief in the squadron, and whoever he trusted to fly with, I'd trust. And so we did the gunnery training and that stuff, and that was no big deal. And we go out, we were flying a Sparrowhawk mission on this October 9th or 10th. And a Sparrowhawk mission was a quick reaction force mission. We go out with a couple of gunships, and we were basically looking for somebody who had problems, who gotten into a shit sandwich, and we provide gun support for them. So we flew out north of Hai Van Pass, north of Da Nang, maybe 20, 25 miles. And we had literally set down, the pilot of our aircraft set our aircraft down on the ground next to a Marine infantry unit. He goes over shooting shit with the company commander of this Marine unit. And Dash 2 aircraft was flying overhead, staying in radio contact with the upper headquarters. So we get an emergency call that there was a shit sandwich going down south of southwest of Da Nang. So we launch and we go down there, and we find out that there's a 17 or 18 man Marine recon patrol that has walked into a U-shaped ambush, and they're getting shot to shit. And they need us to go in and see if they can get their wounded out. We had a hoist on our aircraft. Now, UH-1Es typically were not used for medevacs, and they weren't used to pull people out. But there was one seriously wounded guy on the ground. So we go in and we're overhead and we're trying to drop the hoist down through the canopy. But because we don't have a horse collar on it, won't go down through the canopy. And so they end up deciding that they're going to send in H-34s to pull all these guys out. And so we revert to providing gun cover. What they do is they put one of these 34s in a zone, pick up 3 or 4 guys, leave, and we're flying gun cover and providing rockets and 7.62 during all of this. And this went on for some time while they're getting all these guys out. Finally, they were down to like 2 guys or 3 guys left on the ground. And of course, they're still taking fire from the NVA. And we had run out of ammo and run out of rockets. All we had left was the M79 and 100 rounds of 7.62 and our pistols. And so we didn't have time to go land where we'd been landing, to refuel and rearm. And so the pilot says, I'm thinking about making a couple of dummy gun runs, see if we can get them to hold their heads down long enough to get that last 34 in. What do you guys think? And Charlie and I were both good to go. And I'm sitting there thinking, it just frosts my ass that they're sitting there shooting at my buddies and we're out of ammo. And I started to grab the 100 rounds of 7.62. Charlie told me to kill me if I got it, because that was our emergency ammo in case we got shot down. I didn't have enough sense not to use it. And so I get my pistol out, and I had a box of 38 tracers. Now, nobody had ever heard a 38 tracer being fired in anger in history. So I'm sitting there on the skids of the airplane, and we're making these dummy gun runs. I go, pow, 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 pow. And I was just doing it because there wasn't anything else I could do. There was nothing that I knew to do that would in any way affect the outcome. And so we get the guys out, and we ended up being in combat from about 9 o'clock or 9:30 that morning to about 6 o'clock that night, because we also had another shit sandwich with another larger group of Marines that we provided gun cover for. Well, we go away, and the pilots put in for Silver Star, the co-pilots put in for DFC, and Charlie and I were put in for single mission air medals. And I didn't really think anything more of it. It was, it was a tremendous first day of combat, but shit, I didn't know what to expect. Mm-hmm. Well, like 15 years, 17 years later, by this time I've gotten out of the Marine Corps, I've put myself through college, I've put myself through law school, and I want to write an article for Criminal Defense Magazine. This probably would have been the late 70s or maybe the early 80s. And so I asked this group that I was going to write this article for this Criminal Defense Magazine, can you guys give me one? Just give me an example so I know what your stories all look like. So they give me one, and it's got this black Marine on the front of it. And I can immediately recognize his uniform from the same uniform that I wore when I was there. And I'm thinking, that's cool. The guy was in the Marine Corps same time I was. And then I started reading the story, and the story is about how he was out on this 17 or 18 man Marine recon patrol, and they walked into this ambush, and I said, well, shit, that guy was there same time I was. And, that sounds suspiciously like my mission. And then there was something else in the story, and I don't remember now what it was, but it included, this was the guy who got wounded, who we went in to retrieve, Charles Heads. What had happened is he had come back, had PTSD. He gets into a dispute with his brother-in-law in Shreveport, Louisiana. He ends up shooting his brother-in-law. They try him for capital murder. They convict him. A friend of mine gets hired to represent him. They take it up on appeal. They get it reversed. They try it for the second time and gets convicted of capital murder again. They take it up on appeal. They get it reversed. And then they try it for the third time. And by this time, Welburn Jack Jr., the lawyer who represented this guy, has figured out all about PTSD and flashbacks and how this guy had had an episode of PTSD from the mission where we were trying to save his life like 17 years earlier. So I pick up the phone, and I knew this lawyer. I was doing criminal defense law. So I called Welburn and I said, "Hey, Welburn, I was there." Welburn says, "That's all bullshit." And I said, No. We were there. We provided gun cover for this deal. We were the hueys that were providing gun cover. He said, "That's bullshit. We tracked down everybody who's on the mission." I said, "No, you didn't. You didn't track down any of the aviation units because they were completely separate. I was there on that mission, and we tried to get that guy out and hoist him out." So my buddy's telling me, "You're making this shit up when you tell me you were there." And I said, "No, we end up making a gun run, and we're out of ammo, and I'm sitting there shooting with a pistol, and we got the last 34 out." And he goes, "So that's what that was." I said, "What do you mean, so that's what that was?" He said, "Nobody had any idea what you guys were doing when you're making the gun run with a pistol. The guys on the ground on our side quit shooting as soon as you started making the gun run. And the guys on the other side quit shooting because everybody's looking up in the air. They don't know whether it's a triggering device for an atomic bomb or what. Last 34 goes in, not another round fired. Last 3 guys get out, everything's fine." And it was I didn't really do anything substantive on Heads' case, but my buddy represented him and got him out on PTSD, and I was there when he got out of jail, and it was all going back to a mission that I'd flown in Vietnam, like 17 years earlier. So the message to me of that is, don't ever underestimate your ability to change the outcome of an event. And it was just, my life's been a never-ending series of those kinds of deals.
Jim, ever since I listened to the first time you told that story to Rob, I listened to the audio of that in our game when we're flying with Don Hassey, our friend who served with the 195th and stuff. I always carry a .38 pistol on the birds in the game, just in honor of that story. Can you tell us a little bit about? So obviously with Charlie, that was a direct relationship that came up much, much later. Did you get to know any of the other teams or units that you were supporting? Did you get to know them personally while you were over there, or was that pretty hard to do?
Typically not. They would be stationed someplace other than where we were. He had Hill 327 and was out to the west of Da Nang Airfield. You had mostly Air Force units that were on Da Nang proper. We were at Marble Mountain. You had SOG guys. There was actually a big SOG encampment. I think it was CCN that was immediately south of us at Marble Mountain, but we had no contact with them. We'd never go to where they were, and they'd never come to where we were. And because we were in gunships, the most contact we would have would be when we fly over to one of the camps or one of the bases, and the pilots and the co-pilot would go get briefed on the mission with, for example, the recon people. But we just didn't have much contact with them.
Okay. And your air crew, was that consistent throughout? Well, I'm sure that it changed periodically, but did you serve with the same crew, the same aircraft the whole time you were? Well, I know you said you rotated a little bit, but did you generally stay with the same crew?
No, we rotated a lot. It was I didn't really care who the pilot and co-pilot was. What I cared about was flying with Charlie. Charlie was the most senior crew chief in the squadron and the most experienced. And if Charlie was good to fly with him, I was good to fly with him. Now, I really felt like I was honored to fly with Charlie. But I didn't find out until decades later why I was allowed to fly with Charlie. I was about 120 pounds dripping wet, and Charlie was a pretty big guy. Charlie weighed 180 or 190, was 6 foot tall. And the fact that I was an LBF meant he could carry another 40 or 50 pounds of ammo and rockets and shit. So the only reason I got to fly with Charlie is because I didn't weigh anything. You know, if I'd been a 200-pound guy, it'd make me fly with somebody else. But it was you form a unique relationship with the crews that you fly with, because our life, were dependent on the skill and the knowledge of the pilot and co-pilot, and their lives were dependent on ours. If we failed to provide appropriate gun cover, if we failed to identify the source location of enemy fire, if we gave them bad advice, we put our lives at risk, but we also put their lives at risk. So the relationship between pilot, co-pilot, and crew was really pretty good, particularly in gunships, because we were all in the same deal together.
Got it. Yeah, and Ghost Rider Don kind of talks about the same thing with his experiences with his crews, and
I think he kind of stuck with Eugene Neal, as a pilot. And Gene Neal basically wanted Don on his aircraft as crew chief because he was quite senior again, and so they would tend to pair up quite a lot. So I guess it's the pilot's choice, on that one.
There's another issue that's embedded in this. I've had 50 lawyers that I've worked with in my career who are multi-millionaires as a result of cases that we've worked on together. And most of them, I don't know that I'd give you a picture of warm spit for. I get emails from guys that I serve with or guys that I'm doing missions with, like Neil and on these Medal of Honor missions, almost daily. There's a sort of a fun story about my son, Jimmy, and Charlie. In about 1990, I hired Charlie to go to work for me. I love Charlie, and what I wanted to do was I wanted to bring more people together that I served with in Vietnam. And so I basically put Charlie on my payroll, and Charlie's job was to do newsletters, to do communication, track people down, to bring people together that we'd served with in Vietnam decades earlier. Wow. And Charlie used to go hunting and fishing with me. And my son, Jimmy, who was born in 89, would go hunting and fishing with us from the time he was 4 or 5 years old. And we had a 6,000 acre ranch down in Mexico. And my son grew up listening to Charlie and I sitting around the fire, telling lies, drinking whiskey, telling stories of our heroic youth. And of course, it never occurred to me that Jimmy would end up volunteering to go into the military, volunteering after he graduated from Texas to go into Special Forces and serve as heroically as he did and what he did. And it was after Jimmy was killed, we had this service at the school he'd gone to, Annunciation Orthodox School, and we had about 1,100 people show up for the services. And the common thread was that everybody that knew Jimmy in college and everybody that knew Jimmy in Special Forces loved his storytelling. And I'm sitting there thinking, oh my God, that's all my fault. Because Charlie and I would sit around and we'd drink whiskey and we're out by the fire and we're telling stories. And Jimmy had taken all of those stories to heart. And Jimmy became a well-known and well-loved storyteller. And it was really weird because when Jimmy was with Charlie and I, he was pretty quiet. But when Jimmy would get around to his buddies and they'd start telling stories, Jimmy just came to life in a way that I just didn't know. Somebody told me about one story about Jimmy where it was one spring day up in Austin where Jimmy was a junior or senior at UT, and you got all the honeys coming by in their sundresses, and the boys are out in the grass drinking beer and thinking about all the honeys that surround them. And Jimmy has this thought of just how special his life was. And he stands up and goes, "Take me now, Lord, take me now, I'm in heaven." And, that was my son. And that was all, crap that he got from us when Charlie and I'd sit around and tell him stories. And it was I never spent a minute worrying about losing Jimmy. And the reason I didn't is even though he was in Special Forces, his 3 overseas tours were all in Jordan. And Jordan was safe. And so when Jimmy and the 2 other young men were murdered by that Jordanian soldier, I came to realize the unbelievable impact that it has on our families when they lose their sons or daughters. And I had been distant from that because I just couldn't imagine losing Jimbo. But I became even closer with the Special Forces guys that he served with. In fact, I'll see them. I'll have dinner with one of my daughters tomorrow night in DC, and then I'll have dinner with Jimmy's best friend at Fort Bragg on Wednesday. And I just can't share the profound respect that I've got for those kids. They're good kids. In my view, they're some of the finest kids that serve our country, and I'm frankly honored to have the privilege of knowing them.
That's so great that you keep in contact with his buddies and make them part of the family like that. I'm sure that means so much to them as it means to you as well.
Well, I'll tell you a story about that I learned the hard way. There was a young Marine second lieutenant named James Robert Muckleroy, who I met. I'd flown back to the United States in the summer of '67. And then in about July, I went out to Northern California where I was going to fly back. And I meet this young Marine second lieutenant who's literally fresh out of basic school. And I swear to God, he was as green as grass. And all he wanted to know was what Vietnam was like and how to deal with it and how to handle it. So he and I got to be buddies. And this was a little unusual because he was a grunt officer and I was an enlisted crew chief. But our plane had a mechanical problem in California. So they put us up in a hotel there, and he and I go to a couple of wineries. We had dinner together, and his initials were the same as mine, JRM. And he told me about his family, and he was married, and wanted to be a lawyer after he got out of the Marine Corps. And that was my fantasy at the time, to be a lawyer. So I didn't think anything more of it. We fly to Vietnam, we spend some time together, and then he goes to the grunts and I go back to BMO2. So in February, late January, early February of 68, in fact, I think it was late February because it was after 10, I get an R&R to Hawaii. And so I go over to Da Nang to get on the 707 flying to Hawaii, and there's Muckleroy. And now he's a salty, experienced Marine first lieutenant, good-looking guy, charming and smart, and he's flying to meet his wife in Hawaii. So we fly to Hawaii together. I meet his wife. She had had a little boy a couple of months earlier, and she left them with her parents, and so they do their R&R deal together, and I do my R&R, and then I see him again when we're on the plane going back. And again, this reminds me of what I'd like to become after I get out of the Marine Corps. And then probably that June, that May or June, I pick up Stars and Stripes, and Stars and Stripes would have a column on the right-hand side inside the pages of people who were killed in action. And I look on that, and Muckleroy's in there. And I think, and it was weird because we had lost like 15 or 16 people in VMO2 while I was in VMO2. And while we mourned the loss of every single one of them, Muckleroy hit me much harder than anybody else did. And part of it was this connection that I had with him and this sort of hero worship that I had for him. So I come back and never forgot about Muckleroy. And again, maybe 15 or 20 years after the war, probably would have been the early 80s. I keep thinking about Muckleroy, and by this time I'm an experienced lawyer, and I represented a number of people at the same time. And one of my policies was I'm never going to lose a client. I'm not going to have a client lose their case because they've moved or they've gotten divorced or they've changed their phone number or their address. I'm going to track down every single one of them. And I developed the ability to do that. And I realized I could find Muckleroy's family. So I called the investigators that did my investigation. And I said, look, let me tell you the story about this guy. And he was sort of my hero. And I want to track down his family, and I want to tell his family what I know about him and what I thought of him. So I get a call weeks later. They've tracked down his wife, and his wife's remarried. She's moved on. They've tracked down his son, and they've tracked down his mom and dad and his sisters, and they'd love to hear from him. So I pick up the phone and I call his family, and I have absolutely no idea how they're going connect with me or whether it means anything. I don't have a clue. Come to find out that one of his sisters worked for a friend of mine in Houston. Another one of his sisters went to the University of Houston while I was going to the University of Houston. And his mom and dad, mom and stepfather, had lived in Houston and were just absolutely beside themselves when I called and said, you know, I want to tell you about your boy. And I took him out to dinner. And just, you know, I'm sitting there thinking I barely know the guy. But the fact that I would reach out to him, the fact that I would tell him my impression, my memory of their son and what he was like and how he impacted me meant everything in the world to him. And I really came to appreciate that when we lost Jimmy. Because now that you've got social media, you got email address, I can find anybody today. And I get notes and emails and stories from people Jimmy served with frequently. It'll be his birthday. It'll be his birthday on Thursday, and I'll hear from people that knew him, people that loved him, people that cared about him. And from a family perspective of someone who's lost a son or a daughter, I can tell you there's nothing that means more to us than to hear from the kids that he served with and the people whose lives he impacted. And I would just encourage you to do everything you can do to communicate that thought to your audience, because when we remember the memories of the people that we lose, the memories last forever and they go on forever. And I'm not capable of telling you how important that is to our families.
I think you just did, Jim. And I think everyone will see that and realize it. And, you know, we're in a post-war world. I mean, there is still fighting going on, of course, in various countries, but we're in a post-war world. We just had a 20-year war from America around the world with a war on terror. And so I think that's a really important message for everybody, really, is to reach out and, you know, reach out to family members of people who you've lost, and you know, make contact and keep the memories alive, just like you say. And I think it's important to you know, the way you've shown it there, how it brings comfort to your family, you know, and knowing that the memory is going on. You know, and I have to thank you for inviting me to watch the presentation of the Silver Star for Jimmy posthumously, because that was a very moving ceremony, and that's actually on the internet and can be watched, I think. And it sort of just brought it home. I think your daughter did the sort of the main speech during that, and just so moving. And the website you have as well with the I think you did witness testimonies of the for the family members that went to the court case for the murderer, and I read those, and they're extremely moving, you know, deep memories of Jimmy, and what it's cost your family. You know.
Well, I'll tell you what kills me. We have these spineless political and military leaders who fail to recognize the price that our kids pay and that our families pay. I never encouraged Jimmy to go in the military. No, I didn't do it directly. I certainly did it indirectly because all these endless stories that I've told. But there are thousands of stories just like my story for these kids that we've lost, that we keep on losing, and the Special Forces is going to continue. The special operations folk are going to continue to pay an outsized price, and their families pay a price. And I still believe that there are things in life that are worth dying for, but I think that our highest level political leaders need to ask themselves very carefully what they are and how to avoid it if possible. And I grew up in a world where a third or 40% or 45% of the people who served in Congress had actually served in the military in Korea or in World War II. And we've got a dramatically smaller percentage now. And I continue to believe that military service to our country is valuable, but it's I forget exactly what the number was. I think there might have been like 10 or 15,000 people that graduated the same day Jimmy graduated from the University of Texas, and I think there were a total of like 12 who went in the military. And I'm glad that we're not losing the hundreds of soldiers a month that we were losing while I was in Vietnam. I'd be happy if we weren't losing any. But the price that we pay for these endless wars is a higher price than we probably ought to be paying. And but for the spinelessness of Bush, Obama, Trump, and Biden, Biden finally got around a year after he goes into office, getting us out of Afghanistan. And we should have been out. The truth is, we should have been out of Afghanistan in January of 2002. And if we had had political leaders with any spine, we would have been out, and we would have been vastly better off, and Afghanistan would have been vastly better off. But, it's hard to keep politicians from putting other families, sons and daughters at risk.
I think we've talked to a lot of ex-SOG guys, and they tend to share the view that the job they were doing going over the fence, it was a bit of a suicide mission, and they took over 100% casualties in terms of being wounded multiple times, across the unit. But they had a sense that they were really making a difference. But the whole time they were operating, they were working, they could only go a certain distance into Laos, as you mentioned earlier. In Cambodia, they couldn't have tactical air support. They could have helicopters, but they couldn't have planes. You have all these dumb rules that get put on people, and that still happens now. I hear this from, war on terror veterans, that when they're out there, that they could have got the job done a lot faster if they didn't have one arm behind their back and a massive paperwork to fill in and a load of PowerPoint slides to watch every day about rules of engagement and everything else. Yes, you need to be careful to stay, within the law when you're carrying out these kind, in a conflict, actions in a conflict. But it does seem like, because of the weight of bureaucracy, that things don't get done right. And because of that, a lot, people stay longer, and the longer you stay, the more people needlessly get killed.
Yep.
You agree with that? I think the only way around that is to have better, is to use special forces more, and of course that puts more burden on the brave people who sign up for special forces.
Well, it does, but they're the best trained, the most knowledgeable. They're some of the finest warriors that have ever lived. And if we had a national leadership that had the same character that those kids have, they could be used effectively and with great results. And it's interesting to me. It was fascinating to me. Operation Tailwind was virtually a suicide mission. And it was fascinating to me how successful it became because they violated the rule. We're going to go farther than 12 miles in Laos. And the thing that I think bothers me the most is not when our government lies to other people. It's when our government lies to us. And the only people that didn't know we were in Laos and Cambodia was the American public, who I can remember reading it. They had these, I'd read Time and Newsweek. I read constantly. And when I was in Vietnam, they'd have this lightweight version of Time and Newsweek that was printed in the Far East on lightweight paper, so it didn't cost as much to ship. And I'm reading a story about Lyndon Johnson where he says, well, I'll never send our boys into Laos. And I'm sitting there thinking, well, that dumb son of a bitch will be really surprised when he finds out how many people we sent in Laos. They dropped more bombs in Laos than they dropped in North Vietnam or South Vietnam, but there are times when it's appropriate to not tell the American public the truth. Keeping the Manhattan Project secret, keeping the atomic bomb secret, keeping the American public, and indeed the entirety of upper political leadership in the dark about the atomic bomb made good sense. Because if the Japanese or the Germans knew that we were on that quest, perhaps they would have invented it sooner. But to actively lie to the American public, to actively mislead the American public about the causes and the justification for war is not the same thing by any stretch of the imagination. And it's the truth is that our leadership from 2002 on, well, first off, Bush thought, I could fight with the war I really want to fight is with Saddam Hussein, because I'm still pissed off that he tried to kill my dad. And so he understaffed and underfed the troops in Afghanistan. And then they knew by 2004, 2005, 2006 that they were getting nowhere. And that you didn't have to be Oliver Wendell Holmes to understand we were never going to prevail in Afghanistan. And my heart goes out to those families that lost their sons and daughters, to the thousands of Americans who were crippled for life as a result of their combat in Afghanistan. And they were, our troops go where they're ordered to go. But I met one of the fathers of one of the young men who was killed in, I think it was Apache Valley. And I've met people who were involved in that. And for example, those Medal of Honor missions, or the Air Force crew member Chapman, and the Navy SEALs that were up there. We needed real leadership decades ago, and we could have saved trillions of dollars. We could have saved tens of thousands of lives. And I just worry about how politicalized our entire country has been. I worry about this I lived during the time period when the Vietnam warriors didn't get a fraction of the respect and the care that they get. And then I see this business today where our military members will be walking in the airport and everybody wants to say thank you for your service. And I think we've gone from the frying pan to the fire. Our kids don't want to be thanked for their service. They're not heroes just because they put on a uniform, but they are entitled to be led by competent leadership.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I couldn't put that better. Jim, recently you were inducted as an honorary member in the Special Forces Regiment, and I guess you would have had a ceremony at Fort Bragg for that.
We did.
And what did that mean for you?
I had believed in fighting for what I believe in for most of my life. Now, I've screwed up a lot of things in my lifetime, and I've made bad decisions. I've been a dumbass for much of my life. But I fight for what I believe in, and I've always done it, and I always will do it. To me, it was such an honor to be asked to represent those 3 Special Forces guys that had gotten badmouthed by CNN. It was such an honor to me to be able to fly that Marine 34 and to get to Huey and have it painted in Marine colors and to recognize the service of the people that I served with. And so to some extent, it was the culmination of a lifetime of service and a recognition for that meant everything to me. I badmouthed the CIA, but my son was working for the CIA. I trash talked the Army all the way up through the time period that my son became an Army Special Forces NCO. But like those kids that received the traumatic brain injuries in Iraq, our political leaders at the highest level dishonored their service. Our military leaders at the highest level dishonored their service. And me and my humble band of warriors straightened that horse shit out in literally a matter of a couple of months. And I'll get to see the culmination of that as I go to that awards ceremony on Wednesday. And I think we all have the ability in our lives to do a few things that matter. And when we have those opportunities, I believe we need to capitalize on those opportunities. And I've stumbled in from one to another, not as a result of any brilliant strategic thinking. I mean, when we were making the gun run with the pistol, I wasn't thinking about saving Charles Head's life or getting him out of jail 15 years later. I was thinking those were my buddies down there on the ground. And as long as I got any ammo left, I'm going to send it in the direction of the enemy. And that turned out to have fabulous consequences. I believe that doing the right thing always matters. Fighting to the death always matters. And so that award to me was a recognition of that, and I was thrilled to death to get it.
I know Tilt was very pleased because he told me.
He was. Well, those guys, I give shit all the time. I say, I don't know why you guys think this is such a big deal. This is what all Marines do. But I've grown to know and love those guys, and I'm thrilled to death that you guys are telling their story as